Oh, hi. Didn't see you there. You caught me off guard. Unwary. Absent-minded. Out to lunch. So let's talk about some hobby basics. I'm going to split these what I would consider essentials into two categories. Basic essentials and top tips and things I wish I'd known about before I started hobbying. Essentials. Or TTTIWIKABISHE for short. I'm going to start off where we would start in the hobby process at the beginning, on the sprue. To get your plastic off the sprue, you're going to need a good pair of sharp clippers and a nice sharp knife. I started hobbying years ago with this pen knife, which is a Spyderco knife. It did the job most of the time for scraping off mould lines on models, but I realised that I couldn't get into the finer areas where I wanted to, and it wasn't really doing the job. So I upgraded to a proper hobby knife. This is a Swann Morton handle, and I'm using 10A blades on it most of the time. You can buy these in packs, and I've just found it really durable, really precise, really good. Alternatively, if you don't want to be giving a sharp knife to perhaps a younger hobbyist, you can use nail files. These allow you to sand down the sprue lines on the model without having the risk of someone cutting themselves. Grown-ups, I do recommend getting a nice sharp hobby knife and learning how to use it properly. As for clippers, the first pair I owned were these red electrical clippers. They don't line up very well and they've got blunt over time. Not long ago I got these PCAFC Model 170 pliers. They're not expensive, they're quite cheap, and I found them absolutely fantastic. They've got a good grip on them, they're nice and sharp and precise. You could go crazy spending lots and lots of money on tamiya clippers or something. Finally, on the basic essentials tools is blue tack. Everyone knows what blue tack is, its reputation precedes it, but it really is incredibly useful. Everything from masking off areas on your model that perhaps you don't want to be primed for glue points, sticking pieces of models together to dry fit them before you actually glue them together, or simply sticking miniatures down to something when you want to spray prime them. For only £1, it's a hobby essential. Glues. Now, some people prefer super glue, some people prefer plastic glue. I'm going to recommend for hobby essentials plastic glue, and here's why. Super glue, while it is very fast setting and effective, can be a bit of a fickle mistress. Super glue is very good at holding bonds together without them pulling apart like so. However, it's not very good at holding anything with any sort of torsion, any twisting. So if you drop any of your models, you're much more liable for a bit to pop off than you are with some good plastic glue. Now you can get the nozzle plastic glue, or what I would suggest is Tamiya extra thin plastic glue, or plastic cement as it's sometimes called. This is because you can use the little brush in the pot to carefully apply as much as you want. With the nozzle, you're sort of just relying on moving effectively to get the right amount of glue on the model that you want. After getting Tamiya thin, I'm never going to go back. It's absolutely perfect for applying just the right amount of glue that you want onto the model to get a good bond. Onto brushes, which in their own right could be a whole video, but I'm just going to try and give you some key pointers, maybe things that I missed when I first started. First of all, keep it simple with your brushes. When you first are buying brushes, don't go crazy and buy a super precise, tiny little brush, maybe a size 00, because it's just not going to get used most of the time. Something interesting that I heard Byron from artist Opus talking about recently on the painting phase, the size of your brush is going to equal its lifetime, which makes sense really. The more material you have in the ferrule of the brush, the longer it's going to last, the longer it's going to stand up to the torture that you're going to give it. And you will torture your brushes. This is why I recommend getting a cheap pack of hobby brushes from wherever. Cheap packs of brushes like this are ideal for scooping paint onto your palette, mixing paints together that you want to mix together without ruining the brush that you really want to keep nice. And that segues nicely into my second point, keep it clean. I recommend getting one nice brush that you want to keep clean, perhaps sable, which means it's real hair. Maybe something like a size 1 brush, which you can use for most of the things that you're painting. And try and keep that one brush nice and clean. Use a bit of dish soap in it when you're done using it, leave it upright, not pointing down. Maybe buy some of this brush cleaner, but I wouldn't consider it an essential. And lastly, makeup brushes. Now you might say, why would a makeup brush be a hobby essential? Well, dry brushing is an incredibly powerful tool, and a set of branded dry brushes like artist Opus's Series D are quite a big investment for someone just getting into mini painting. Makeup brushes do a very good job for their investment. I mean, I got a whole pack of these. They couldn't have been more than a few quid. Essential. On to paints. Now again, like brushes, this could be a whole video and I am by no means an expert on paints. However, through my stupidity, you may glean some wisdom. When you first start, Don't go out and buy one of these massive packs of hundreds of paints. You're not going to use them all. It's that simple. Maybe you're starting out with one box set or a big set of models, perhaps something like Leviathan that just released. All of those paints are not going to find a place to be used. With time, as you gradually improve in your painting and you learn to mix and blend certain colours, highlight, I'm sure you'll use more paints. Gradually build up your collection of paints as you get better. To start out with, the absolute essential paints I would recommend are a good black paint and a good white paint. With these, you're basically going to be able to create every gradient from white to black, which is incredibly useful for painting. And your prime colours, which you can use to blend together and make most other colours. The vast majority of acrylic paints these days do blend very well together, even if they have multiple pigments in them. And lastly, a metallic paint. Generally speaking, whatever you're painting, there's going to be something metal in it, and it's good to have a solid, reliable metal paint that you can rely on to fill in any metallic details. You can also mix these together with other pigments to create other colours. The last point on paint: spray primers. Now generally I would recommend black for one simple reason: it covers really well and it's easy to build from because you're working out of the shadows. This means that if you do miss any areas in the finer details of your model, it won't matter as much because it will look like shadows. Whereas if you use a grey or a white prime and you miss those areas, it looks a bit off. Basically, this is safer if you make any mistakes, which you will.
You will, we all do.
Brand wise, I'm using Colourforge at the moment. I've heard Citadel and Army Painter are both very good. I tried to cheap out once and used Rust-Oleum, and not good, don't recommend. Get a proper miniature spray paint. Next, a painting handle. Now, a lot of people would say that these aren't a necessity. You could use blue tack and stick them to a bottle lid, but personally, I find something that securely keeps your miniature in place while you paint it essential. These are only about £7 from Games Workshop. They're very well built. I mean, I've been using this for years, primed over it, thrown it across the room. It's absolutely solid. And I've never had a miniature pop out of it, fall off of it. When you're painting, you don't want to overhandle the miniature, and this is a mistake that I made early on. Some miniatures I'd be trying to paint without a painting handle, and I would be rubbing the corners or the edges of the model while trying to paint other areas, and it would cause the paint to rub off, and sometimes even the primer, like I mentioned with the Rust-Oleum, which means that you're going back over details, you're having to repaint things, and it's just not worth the time and effort. Get a painting handle, you won't regret it. Lastly, and probably most importantly, light. Now you can't argue with this. If you're going to argue with this, I'm going to argue with you, and then we're going to argue. Light is essential to painting. If you can't see what you're painting, you're not going to paint it very well. So get a good overhead light for your workspace. Most of them come with some sort of clamp or something that you can clamp to the underside of a table. It's literally a night and day difference painting with and without light. TTTIWIKABISHE. So now that we've tackled the absolute basic essentials for hobbying, let's move on to some things that I made mistakes on in the past and I think are a great addition if you're a developing hobbyist. First of all, something I think is key is a good workspace. Now, I first started off just working away in front of my desk, but having a dedicated space to focus on building and painting really does go a very long way. The reason I didn't put this in essentials is it's not possible for everyone to have a dedicated workspace. A lot of people are hobbying on their table, and that's fine as long as you've got a light. But if possible, I really would advise carving out a little space for just your hobby. And at the centre of that workspace should be your cutting mat. So you've got your new workspace area. The last thing you want to do is ruin it with paint, glue and cutting bits into it. Get yourself a good cutting mat. These are very cheap on Amazon. I recommend getting as big as you have space for, really. A3 at a minimum, A2 preferably. This gives you more than enough space to do multiple things. Things you should keep away from your cutting mat are heat, this will cause it to warp, and white spirits and plastic glue spills, which will melt it. Second, some additional hobby tools that I didn't think I would need, and I absolutely did. Pin vise and drill bits. I remember watching a hobby video telling me that I would need a pin vise at some point to drill barrels or pin models, and I ignored it, and then I ended up scrambling around on Amazon rapidly trying to find one. Pretty much any old regular pin vise drill will work. For drill bits, I do recommend PCB drill bits, as they're incredibly sharp, meant for drilling through PCBs. Nothing worse than having a blunt drill bit and trying to jam it through whatever you're trying to get through. Next tool is tweezers. As much as we rely on our fingies for doing the delicate fine work, sometimes they're just not precise enough. A set of tweezers can give you the dexterity to pick up any small precise bits, perhaps bits you want to glue onto your miniature, without having to worry about getting your fingers in the way, getting them covered in glue. Moving on to number 3, gap fillers. I'm bracketing these in together here even though they do serve different purposes. I'd recommend getting some texture paste. For example, this AK Interactive Muddy Ground. Now I didn't think I needed this when I first started hobbying. I thought I could make my own, and you can make your own, but it does really help for the price to just have a tub of this on hand to quickly slap on some miniatures. If you're doing big units of 10, you don't want to be faffing around making your own basing material, like I showed you how to do in my first video, when for less than a tenner, you can get a tub of this stuff and it will serve you well. Experiment with both and use them appropriately. Our next gap filler is green stuff, or milliput, whichever you prefer. Advantage to green stuff is it's a bit more tacky and rubbery, easier to mould in my experience. I'd recommend getting some Vaseline with it to help stop your fingers and tools sticking to it. You only need a tiny little bit. Milliput is water soluble, which means you can sort of water it down to the consistency you want, which makes it very good for getting into gaps. Fourthly, manipulating paints. Now what do I mean by manipulating paints? I highly recommend making yourself a texture palette, which I showed you how to do in this video. This massively helps in testing paints out before you apply them to one of your valuable models, or removing paint for something like dry brushing. I highly recommend getting a wet palette. This helps you control your paint better, it keeps the paint wetter for longer, which means you'll use less paint, and again, it gives you somewhere to experiment with the paint as you water it down and try it out before you put it on the model. These aren't too expensive, but again, I'd be amiss recommending it as a essential because you do not need it. It's just very, very good to have. I need it though. And then there's matte medium, which I highly recommend using as a tool to do a slew of different things, because essentially it's just paint without the pigment. I highly recommend a video from Midwinter Minis, which I'll put in the description, showing you all the different things you can do with just a little matte medium. And lastly, we just have a few odds and sods that I can't really put into any category, but they've served me very, very well. Patented anti-spill technology, which honestly, once you've spilled a paint, you never want to do it again. I made this from a sponge and a cut up plastic bottle, and it saved me who knows how many pounds in Citadel wash bottles. Come here. It's free real estate. If you have a lot of paints to shake, which I warned you about, I'd highly recommend getting one of these, a paint shaker. Shout out to Paul if you're watching, thanks for this. This will stop you getting RSI from constantly shaking paints all the time. And finally, a timer. This is something I only got recently, but watching high-level painters, you may have realised that they have timers on their desks. This helps them keep track how long they've been painting for, how long they need to do a step for before moving on to the next, or simply how long it's been since the paint they put on has dried for. Again, you can get these very cheap on Amazon, so there's no harm in picking one up, considering how helpful it can be in managing your painting. And that's everything. That's all I've got. That's all my wisdom. It's in one video now. It's out there. I've got nothing left to offer the world. However, if you'd like to give me something, most of the products listed in this video are down in the description with my affiliate links. But thank you for joining me for this. If you found these tips helpful, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments anything I missed. Maybe share it with a friend who's getting into the hobby. And for Half Crafted, that's all for now. Have a good day.